Hi there. It's September the 5th, and we're continuing our voyage through Paul's second letter to the Corinthians, and we're in chapter 8, and we're reading from verses 1 to 15. Paul opens up a subject here in chapter 8, which he's already dealt with in his previous letter in 1 Corinthians in chapter 9. That is about the support, material support and financing of the gift of the work of God through the Corinthian people. Now remember, in 1 Corinthians 9, Paul actually said he wasn't going to receive anything from the Corinthians for the ministry that he'd been bringing, because he didn't want them to think, or he didn't want them to claim, that he was just in it for the money. But here in 2 Corinthians 8, he kind of does a very interesting thing. He demonstrates what generosity is like to the Corinthians by presenting to them the example of the Macedonian churches. Now, Macedonia and the north of Greece was the place that Paul seems to have been crossing through. It's where he met Titus coming, bringing him news from the south of Greece, from Corinth. And here he says, even though these churches in Macedonia were very poor, they have given out of what they have, and they've exceeded Paul's expectations. The gifts that they're giving to are most likely the gifts that Paul is collecting to carry back to the church in Jerusalem, because they've been in a place of hardship, they've been suffering persecution, and they've been in a time of famine. So Paul is making a collection for them. He says the Macedonian churches have excelled in their giving. And so he uses this as a kind of a goad to the Corinthian churches. He says, so you are also abundant. Corinth, you have so much wisdom, you have so much insight, you have so much gifting among you, so much spirituality. So also, why don't you share in this way as well, in this practical giving? And then Paul uses a really good picture in the second half of the reading, where he basically says, look at Jesus. Jesus was rich beyond all measure in heaven, and he gave up his riches and became poor, totally poor, for our sakes, that you, Corinthians, through his poverty might become rich. So how can you gainsay that when you see that Jesus has actually given up everything that he has? And then lastly in this reading, Paul homes in on the fact that when someone gives out of a lack, they aren't lacking at the end of the day, because God is blessing them back. And so also when people have abundance, as the Corinthians have, they need to be giving and sharing in this. There needs to be an equal share. He actually uses the word towards the end of the reading, the Greek word isotis, that means equality. It says that they should be taking an equal share. The Macedonian churches are poor and they've contributed, but Corinth is not poor, and they therefore also should share the load. And lastly, Paul uses a picture from the gathering of manna in the Hebrew scriptures, in the story of Israel in the wilderness, where he says those who gathered much, those who gathered a lot, didn't have anything left over, and those who gathered a little were in need of nothing. And he uses this as the picture of not amassing material wealth, of not amassing material things, because it's not a question of how much we have, it's a question of the grace of God upon us and his giving. It's so important in very practical things like this, which actually traditionally the Church of Jesus is not very good at handling and not very good at talking about, that we hear Paul here clearly saying there's a principle here. Our lives are demonstrated through our giving. Our life of Jesus is also demonstrated not just in the spiritual things, not just in the ethereal things, but in the very practical ways that we show care through our giving. Let's hear what Paul is saying to us today, and let us be sure that we are able to give and bless others, so that we can take our responsibility before God as well. Have a very good September the 5th.